Welcome back to Hand in Hand, Place to Place, Transforming Teacher Preparation. I'm Valerie Sakimura, your podcast host and the Executive Director of Deans for Impact, a national nonprofit with a mission of ensuring all students access well-prepared teachers. This 5-episode podcast series examines how teacher preparation has evolved over the last decade, where it's headed, and how stakeholders can work together to ensure all pathways into teaching are affordable and high quality. Today, we're exploring the intersection of two fields that are deeply connected, but too often operate without intentional collaboration: pre-K-12 education and teacher preparation. We know that teacher preparation is essential for student success, yet when we look at how policy is developed and funded, teacher preparation and PK-12 are frequently treated as separate efforts. That disconnect impacts how new teachers are trained, supported, and retained, and has real consequences for student learning. That's why I'm excited about today's conversation, which really digs into what's possible when advocacy organizations, policymakers, and system leaders work together to bridge this gap. I'm joined by 3 incredible leaders who are doing exactly that. Jennifer Alexander, Executive Director of Pi Network. David
Hello.
Rosenberg, Leader in Residence at TeachPlus, and Ryan Franklin, Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at Philanthropy Advocates. Together, we'll explore how aligning teacher preparation and PK-12 policy at both the federal and state levels can strengthen the teacher workforce and better support students. I'm going to ask each of you to just say hello and tell us a bit more about your organizations. Jen, why don't we go to you first?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Jen Alexander. I'm the Executive Director of the Pi Network, and Pi Network is a national voluntary membership organization that connects, supports, and catalyzes the work of education policy advocates. So we have about 180 members in 38 states and DC, and the vast majority of our members work at the state and local level.
David, to you.
Thanks. Great to be here, and congrats to Deans for Impact on your 10th year and more. So my name's David Rosenberg. I'm a leader in residence of TeachPlus, and TeachPlus's mission is to develop teachers as leaders and empower them to take action as advocates for their students in state houses and in local communities. So you can imagine our TeachPlus folks intersect with Jen's network and work deeply. We currently work in 13 states with plans for more over the next few years. My main work here is that I facilitate the Coalition to Reimagine the Teaching Role, and that is a diverse national group of leaders focusing on creating conditions where every student experiences rigorous grade level, affirming learning, surrounded by effective and thriving educators.
Glad you're here. And Ryan.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Ryan Franklin, and I co-lead an organization called Philanthropy Advocates. Our organization brings together about 60 grant makers who invest in public and higher education in Texas, and we try to take those lessons learned from the philanthropic sector and elevate those in policy and advocacy conversations in the Texas Capitol. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Well, I'm so excited to have you all here because I think you see different parts of the system and can speak to different perspectives. So I think we're going to have a rich conversation. And I'm really excited to talk with you all today about solutions and bright spots that we're seeing. But before we jump into that, I think it's really important to first kind of illuminate the stakes when PK-12 and teacher preparation policy are not aligned. I think one example that is very live for me these days is all of the great work that has happened in states to pass legislation that ensures that students in their schools are getting access to scientifically based reading instruction, and seeing that some of the legislation that would support teacher preparation programs in moving in that same direction came much later or after the fact. Turning to you all, kind of what have you seen happen when we see pre-K-12 policy and teacher preparation policy operate in silos, and why do you think that's so often the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've named like an existential question of the work of changing systems. And I think part of the challenge is just how siloed advocacy can be. You see disparate interests working in a world where the goal is to win your policy win, right? And your priority in education, that might be, we need higher teacher pay, we need teacher residencies, or we need a new funding formula. But we all know this, right? At the end of the day, this is not a collection of individual policies that make education go. It's a complicated system. And we have a complicated goal, right, of ensuring that millions of kids get the skills, grow up with the skills and the support they need to live choice-filled lives, to shape their own destiny, no matter where they were born or where they were raised. And so I think that siloing is a real challenge. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited to be doing the work we're doing at TeachPlus, because teachers, by definition, see many angles of the picture, right? They see a student. And if you talk to any teacher about their work, they'll tell you, like, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And the farther away you get from the classroom, the more that appears to be the case.
I really appreciate David emphasizing the systems aspect of all this thing, because all of this operates within systems, and you make a change on one side of the system that has an impact that you're not considering on the other side of the system, and it has real implications for teachers and students. I think what we saw in Texas is several years before the pandemic and the pressures that brought, our legislature had created a lot more flexibility for our school districts in terms of how they staff our schools, and they took advantage of that. And we consequently have had, over the last several years, over half of our new teachers be completely unprepared, uncertified, with no connection to what's going on in the preparation. So when that became an option, people fled from pursuing certification, flew from rigorous preparation programs because they could get the job without that. So a change meant to create some regulatory flexibility on the school district staffing side really had a major impact on pulling people away from preparation and certification. And what we saw with that is much higher teacher attrition rates, a revolving door around uncertified teachers, students who were losing 3 to 4 months of instruction in reading and math, and real impacts on student learnings from those silos and that disconnect.
From my own experience, I think the incentives are not aligned to create simultaneous change in both K-12 and higher education around this issue. And by that, I mean a couple of things. One is the incentives for higher education to change would typically be employer demand, right? Districts want a certain type of candidate, so the teacher preparation programs will then produce it, would be like the rational thinking. But that often isn't the case. So several of us have been in districts that have recently enacted work to change how reading is taught, and also need to hire a bunch of teachers and have talked to the programs in their area, but those programs aren't changing fast enough. And honestly, they don't really need to, because where else are the teachers going to come from? The districts don't have a lot of other options in terms of where they can hire teachers. So there's not a lot of built-in incentives for change, because the graduates are likely going to get hired anyway. And my own experience is also, if you're trying to move a large bill, let's use reading as an example, around literacy that might have multiple pieces in it. One of the areas where we ran into the most resistance politically was around some of the higher education and teacher prep proposals. So those proposals often got dropped because we couldn't get the whole thing through and we couldn't reach compromise on that piece. And part of that, and my state may be unique, but we have a part-time legislature, and some of the people who serve in the legislature work at institutions that prepare our teachers. And so there was a lot of resistance to change kind of baked into the system that made it very difficult to change.
Yeah, I totally agree that incentives are sometimes misaligned. And I think, in our work, we do see these pockets of innovation within teacher preparation programs in ways that are supportive of some of the goals in PK-12 classrooms. And I think there's lots of challenges, and we heard some of them already. But I also think what's really cool about this last year is that we've seen some incredible progress where people have been able to bring coalitions of pre-K-12 folks and teacher prep partners together to advocate for stronger policies that support teachers and students. And Ryan, I think one standout example to me over the last year is the work that you've been really involved in Texas with the passage of House Bill 2, which was this historic state investment in public education, and specifically Article 2, which promises to invest more in expanding the affordability of teacher training, incentivizing more practice experiences for aspiring teachers, and strengthening their instructional preparation. And I know many Texas organizations came together in different ways to advocate for this bill. So Ryan, you're right smack dab in the middle of all of that work. Where did you see PK-12 and teacher prep partners working together to influence the outcomes of those policy conversations?
Yeah, we're really excited about House Bill 2 and what's called the prep allotment within the bill. And prep, because we're education, we have to have acronyms, but partnership is one of the key words in that prep allotment. So that really is the basis for the policy of really contemplating schools and teacher preparation programs working together in partnership to move things forward for future teachers and students. And really, a lot of this work started well before the last legislative session. Philanthropy had seen the need arising to strengthen our teacher workforce in the state, and really Texas is a big state with lots of local challenges within the human capital space, and Philanthropy had supported regional communities of practice to get these folks talking, the district leaders and the teacher preparers in that given region, to think about these things more broadly. And what came out of that were some proof points about how to partner together, how they could change models of preparation in ways that really gave us the proof points we needed to go into the legislature and to advocate for change. We had something that had sort of been, catalyzed with philanthropic investments locally, and that we'd been able to elevate proof points from. It really took off coming out of the pandemic, where Governor Abbott established a teacher vacancy task force to bring folks together at more of a statewide level. And so we were able to sort of use that statewide vehicle to leverage some of the learnings we'd had in regions all around the state to really make changes and make the case that preparation matters and how our teachers are trained matters, and them having those skills in early literacy and numeracy when those teachers are coming in the classroom, that matters. Them having experience with students before entering the classroom matters. So it was really powerful how we were able to sort of tap into those existing local conversations and for the advocates to be able to elevate those things with policymakers.
Jen, you have this vantage point as the executive director of Pi Network, where you're getting to look across the country and seeing other places where there is real policy movement. Where else have you been seeing some of the Pi Network members coming together to successfully champion policies that strengthen teachers' journeys from kind of preparation through kind of their development and later in their career?
Yeah, we're seeing lots of exciting work happening, including the work that Ryan talked about, which is a finalist for a Pi Network Eddie Award this year. So Ryan and the Texas team, congratulations. I think we're also seeing in other places. So some of you were with us. We went to Tennessee and we hosted a literacy site visit, and we spent a lot of time talking with Tennessee leaders about the work that they're doing there with advocates on the ground like SCORE, and with educator preparation programs and districts through the Lead in Literacy Network, and really thinking about how you align teacher candidate preparation and mentor support experiences, especially around early literacy instruction at that point, so that we're preparing teachers. A member in North Carolina, Best NC, has been supporting Teach NC in an ongoing way in related efforts to drive high-impact, low-cost teacher recruitment and training, which have led to an increase in EPP, Educator Preparation Program, sorry to use the acronym, enrollment, and a more diverse pipeline of prospective teachers and better alignment with the classroom. And we also have national partners that have worked with folks on the ground, like Deans for Impact, like NCTQ, to help shape resources and policies really across the country, including in places like Indiana, Oregon, Georgia, the more one state starts to do something and then another state starts to do something, they look to their neighbors and think, oh, well, if so-and-so did it and so-and-so did it, we can do it too. And that just creates momentum and more proof points of what's possible, which is great.
Absolutely. David, I want to come back to something that you said up front, which was, from a teacher's perspective, they don't think about these as kind of discrete things. We've seen how powerful it can be when teachers are mobilized as advocates who can talk about the connection between all of these different policy spheres. So I want to bring you in because I know a lot of the work that TeachPlus does is work with thousands of teachers to influence policy and practice. So what have you been seeing or hearing from TeachPlus teachers on the policy issues that they care most about, particularly around teacher preparation and development?
I don't think it's that different from what we've been hearing in terms of what they want. We've been hearing from teachers for years, and that their preparation has to prepare them for the real life teaching of real life students. And so I got to short story this summer. I was with a dozen teachers. Half of them were TeachPlus fellows as part of a partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And one of our TeachPlus fellows is a woman, and she teaches second grade over in Las Vegas. And she mentioned that she recently went back one night and looked at her ed school books on teaching theory. And she was curious to sort of try to connect it with her life. And so, to be clear, Emma is like so many of the teachers that we celebrate. She's a superhero who has energy and passion and I think in superhuman ability to operate with very little sleep. So she had the ability to be like, I'm actually going to go do this and the responses of the other teachers in the room were really interesting. Some of them were like, when would I do that, given the cadence of my life? But what they said out loud was, I guess I could do that if I had the time, go back and look at my ed school books on teaching theory. But how would that change what I do tomorrow? Like, how is it going to connect with what I do with my kids every day? And what we hear most often from teachers is what I did in school, in ed school, I cannot apply a lot of that in my daily work. And so what they want is to be trained and supported in ways that help them have a real life impact on students. And I think that speaks to some of the issues we're describing about the connections between teacher prep, higher ed, and K-12 in terms of what do those pathways look like? What does that on-ramp look like? What are the things we're preparing teachers for? Not because they have to learn everything before day one, but what are the things that we can be doing to help them be ready for the work and also help them be advocates for the way the work should work in schools going forward.
I think that was such an important part of our journey here in Texas, and Deans for Impact was an essential partner in that. TeachPlus was an essential partner in that. Pi Network sort of keeping a lot of us together and learning from each other and us being able to tap into that national expertise, but being able to bring the teacher voice and to have the coalition of the willing ready and able to make changes on the educator preparation side. And a lot of those are folks that have worked with Deans for Impact through the years. And so that was just really helpful in us moving that forward.
David, I really appreciated hearing Emma's story because I think sometimes when people hear policy, they think of something that's very, very far removed from the everyday lives of people, teachers, students. And I'm constantly reminded, and I think all of you have reminded me recently about, that policy is about people and about people's lives and their day-to-day experiences. Ryan, Jen, I'm curious from the two of you, is there an interaction recently you've had with a teacher or a student that has impacted how you're thinking about policy right now?
My own kids' experience and sort of seeing the contrast between them having a teacher who had the kind of preparation and support they needed to be successful versus not. My own high school student taking geometry and having a teacher, first year teacher, no preparation, no support, and that teacher really struggling. And consequently, my student, my own child, really struggling and losing confidence in their own math abilities and their own, kind of dreams for their own future. Contrasted with the next year in Algebra 2, having a great teacher who was well prepared and well supported and had the skills they need to help my student be successful, and just knowing that how much that did to build my child's confidence and they're considering a STEM career. And so the teacher makes all the difference, and we need to put into our teachers so they can, deliver for our students.
Absolutely. And sadly, I think that experience you described about your own child is so common, right? That kids, just depending on the luck of the draw that year in that grade, may have a teacher who is really well prepared and well supported, and or may not. And I think we want to eliminate the kind of lottery feeling to teacher assignment, that no matter which teacher's classroom your child is placed in, that teacher is well prepared and ready to support every student in their classroom.
So my story is a slight about the random chance of the quality of your education, but it's dialing even further out to the state that you live in, and it's about two kids. So one is my niece and one is my nephew. My niece lives in Connecticut, and is in high school now, and my nephew is in first grade and lives in Texas. And my niece was struggling in elementary school with reading, and was sent to all kinds of interventions, had to go to like eye training and nothing was working. She was getting incredibly frustrated. My brother and sister-in-law were getting frustrated. Finally, basically towards the end of her elementary school experience, someone did a screener and realized that she had dyslexia, and she started to get the supports that she needs. But frankly, like, from my opinion, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't push harder as her aunt, it was a little too late for her. She's doing okay now, but I think it's not been an easy road for her to get to where she is now as a ninth grader. And that's because at that point, Connecticut didn't have a law requiring any sort of screener for students. Contrast that with my nephew's experience. So in kindergarten last year, he got a letter sent home to my brother and sister-in-law saying that he was showing some signs of potential reading challenges, and did they have permission from my brother and sister-in-law to do a screener, and cited the state laws that require them to send that letter home. He is getting a screener. We'll see, what happens there, but is hopefully going to get the intervention that he needs much, much earlier than my niece did, and will have a dramatically different experience in elementary school and beyond, I hope. And that's really the difference there is policy. And so I think for me, that's a really powerful example of how policy can change a kid's experience, and that it's not fair that your ability to learn to read might depend on the state that you live in.
One thing that really stands out in that example, Jen, is it's policy, and it's also the implementation of policy, right?
Yes.
The policy passed, but then there were things that had to happen in order for that letter to actually get sent, right?
Yeah.
And so
And for the conversation with that teacher to happen,
exactly,
and for my nephew to get what he needs. Yes.
And so let's spend a little bit on implementation, because it's so important. And I know it's something that all of you pay attention to, that if we do want policy to have a meaningful impact on people, the implementation really needs to be attended to. And sometimes it gets lost in conversations about policy. So I'm curious from each of you, what are some of the biggest challenges you all have seen in the implementation of promising policy efforts, and how can state PK-12 and teacher preparation leaders work together to navigate some of those implementation challenges?
I'll pick up on Jen's story of Connecticut versus Texas, is that the policy is to exist, but it also has to be implementable by real people, right? I don't know the letter of the law in Texas, but my guess is that it was written in a fairly straightforward way that allowed those teachers to do what they had to do according to the law to inform Jen's brother and sister-in-law about it, right? That, like, it is a doable thing. It is not just creating distraction or hoops, and it's purposeful in approach. I know that's always the intent of policy, but obviously lots of things can happen in the sausage making process. And the other thing I would just say is, like, policy to practice is an eternal question, and implementing meaningful change in complicated systems is complicated work, and these systems haven't, in spite of our best efforts, like, haven't changed all that much. So you need guidance, you need accountability, you need funding, maybe But then you need thousands and thousands of adults to change behaviors, and a lot of those behaviors are really deeply ingrained. And so you need leadership that's consistent. All those pieces coming together it can feel like a perfect storm. But the one thing I'll put out there is a very wise person named Jennifer Alexander. You may have met her a couple of years ago. Shared an insight with me that has really stuck, which is that when elections come and go, advocates are the ones who stick around, and they're the ones who have the through line. They have the story. They know what the environment is. They know what's come before. And so I feel like having that consistent vision among advocates and some of the coalition work that Ryan and Jen, you both talked about happening, where no matter who the next person up is in a given chair in an elected or appointed position, the community vision and priorities remain consistent, and the people who see the pieces connected are the ones who are driving that. That to me is when we see it happening, that I think we're seeing more and more of that kind of cohesion and that kind of sort of leadership from within.
Can I jump in here and just chime in on what David said? And I think that's so important, especially in this moment where, the 2026 election cycle, we're going to see, I think it's at least 15 governors term limited out, and I think 36 states are going to be electing a governor with even more down ballot changes, which makes the role, since so many states have made moves on literacy and on teacher preparation, makes the role of advocates even more important. And I mentioned before that we went on some site visits to see literacy work in action. We went to Tennessee and we went to New York City. Tennessee has a few more years under their belt in doing this work on literacy. New York City implementing NYC Read, still pretty new. Both are going to have new leaders. So Tennessee is going to elect a new governor. New York City is going to elect a new mayor. And the continuity of this work that is showing real promise is going to be really important. And I think there's two things that we saw, well, many things that we saw, and we actually wrote a piece about the similarities in both places. We visited the smallest little rural county in Tennessee, and New York City is the largest school district in the country. And actually, there was a lot more similar than you would think. One was really high quality professional development for teachers, often with an external provider. And two was really, it stuck with me that we visited with very senior teachers in both places who were not so sure at first about what they were being asked to do and changing their practice, but they started to see results. They said, all right, we're going to do this. They had leaders that supported them. They had professional development they needed, and they started to see a change. Like they had been doing almost everything else right, except for how to teach reading the way that evidence tells us to. And when they started to see those results, they became believers. They started talking to each other. And then you sort of start to see this momentum take hold. And I don't think they're going to let that go, because they now understand that they have this tool in their toolbox that they didn't have before, that's making them the kind of educator that they want to be. And so I think telling those stories, celebrating the successes that you start to see early on, helps build momentum to keep it going, to keep improving implementation and stick with it over time.
Yeah, I think those proof points are so important. It's kind of getting to the tipping point of implementation on something. And so that's one of the challenges that I think we face here in Texas in particular, is just such a high volume of policy passed, and how we're able, like how local decision makers and implementers are able to get through that, and sort of initiative fatigue and this tendency to say, well, the leaders are going to change, we'll just wait them out before we implement things. And what I'm excited about how we structured some of these teacher policy changes is that they've actually made the changes before the policy was there. And so there is some willingness and some interest. So they're going to be able to look and see some of their neighbors implementing some of these things that are hard, and they have results that they can point to. So some hope that maybe we can get to that tipping point a little more quickly on policy innovation than we otherwise would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think the timeline is always like, how do we give people enough time for implementation to take hold before folks are on to the next thing, given how frequently these transitions happen. Another thing about this moment in time, we're recording this episode during a government shutdown, and a moment when tough budget trade-offs are front and center. With the end of American Rescue Plan funds and the cancellation of many long-standing bipartisan initiatives, how can we make sure that teacher training and development remains a priority given the really tough budget trade-offs I think many folks are juggling with?
To us, it's common sense that these things matter, but to policymakers, it is often not common sense. And they are surrounded by narratives that also often run against the grain on that. And so I don't think we can take anything for granted on what matters and what makes a difference in terms of student learning, educators feeling successful and wanting to choose to come into the field and stay in there. But I think you've got to keep proving it up and showing the evidence over and over again and highlighting those bright spots and telling those stories and working across sectors and across partnerships and across different stakeholder types to continue to elevate these things as investments that are worth making.
Before I really answer your question, I just want to, really double down on how you framed the question, which is we're in a moment where funding for education is really going to be in flux, I think, for the next several years. There was just a McKinsey report, I think, that got released yesterday, echoing what we're hearing from other sources, that funding looks like maybe it's going to be flat at best. At worst, we're going to see declines for a host of reasons, including declining enrollment, shifting federal funds, flat state revenues, some other federal policy changes that are going to strain state and then district budgets. So we're looking at a place where folks at the state and district level are going to have to make hard choices. That same McKinsey report found that a majority of districts report that they are considering staff reductions, and 69% are not going to hire new staff as a precaution against future funding shortfalls. And of those not laying off teachers, most of them are relying on attrition to reduce costs, but that's not going to kind of help them retain teachers in the most strategic way or use their talent in the most strategic way. So we're going to be in a really difficult period where it's going to be critical for advocates working with leaders to help focus on what are the core priorities that are going to most likely move student achievement. So one, that means we have to keep measuring student achievement. And two, understanding what is working to move student achievement. Our poll, which is a cross-partisan poll with an oversample of primary voters, because that's where most elections are won or lost these days, is pretty consistent with what you see in other polls, which is voters want decision makers to, if they have to make hard choices, and they actually don't support education funding cuts across party lines, but if cuts do have to be made, if hard choices do have to be made, they want elected leaders to prioritize reading and math and other core functions of what they consider to be essential to a student's success. And that includes training teachers on how to best teach students reading and math. So we have to help connect the dots on what this professional development is doing, how it's connected to helping student learning on the things that voters and parents care about, and then sort of make that case.
Yeah, it's especially in this time and listening to the examples that you are giving and thinking about the work in Texas and Michigan and other places of what brings people together in with commonality is so rare in our world, but finding those spaces is so huge. And so some of what I will share here, I think falls into that space, which in particular, the stuff that I spend a lot of time on and that we focus on is the integration of two ideas that are, I think, pretty powerful. One is how do you implement great curriculum, often in the form of high quality instructional materials, and how do you create, sort of break down the isolation of teaching and create more team-based models. And so at TeachPlus, we recently launched something called the Center for Inspired Teaching and Exceptional Learning. And through that, we are facilitating a whole set of pilots around the country with many amazing leaders that are testing this idea of saying, how do you implement great curriculum and do so with high quality instructional materials and do so in the context of a team-based model in which teachers have the support that they need from each other and from coaches and leaders to be successful. And that's an area that is still fairly unexplored as a unified theory of action. I would like to see more EPPs sort of preparing teachers to act on each of those strategies, right? Like can we set teachers up in a way where they're working with HQIM through their prep programs, getting the coaching and support that they need, so when they show up on day one, it's not the experience that Ryan described, of the geometry teacher who was really struggling, because of the familiarity, but also with the content, but also can we set up the EPP work with districts and other system leaders so that teachers are learning from the beginning how to work together in their daily practice, right? If we had teachers coming out of their prep programs expecting to work in teams collaboratively, expecting their work to vary from one person to another, expecting to really wrestle with the depth and challenge of teaching using high quality instructional materials and the rich and relevant content that students really need. Like, I think that would both smooth their path in and potentially, create this next vanguard of educators coming in and say, this is how it's supposed to work.
Thinking about some of the innovative staffing models, or David, I don't know, we're calling it strategic staffing these days, but different ways of designing the teacher role that making sure teacher preparation candidates have exposure to that and have the opportunity to even work as an apprentice or student teacher in those kind of environments, I think would go a long way towards changing teaching, especially if we're in, as I described earlier, a situation where we're not maybe going to be hiring as many new teachers. So we have to use those that we have in the most strategic way. I also think we're seeing more changes around educator licensure, some grow your own and teacher apprenticeship models that are really exciting. Really excited about what we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation about how we can better connect teacher preparation programs and research-based practice and high-quality instructional materials. And I will say, I think that also requires not just a policy shift, but a cultural shift in how we think about teacher preparation versus other professional preparation programs where there's an expectation that you're going to stay current with the latest research and apply that in your practice. That's not really been the case in teaching, and I come from a traditional teacher prep background too many years ago, but that was never the case for me, and I still think it's not the case for many. And that doesn't mean where you expect every teacher to be able to log on to the Whatworks Clearinghouse and change their practice based on what it says, but they should at least know those things exist and understand where and how they can find out what the latest research says. And then I think the last thing is, which I people much smarter than me will have to help answer, but with the emergence of AI and lots of AI developers selling their programs to teachers and to schools, figuring out what is the best, most effective use of AI as a tool, both for teachers and for students. That is, what does good look like? How do we make decisions about that? We can't avoid AI. Our kids are going to need to know how to live in a world where that is part of their work and their lives. But what does it look like? And how can AI actually help make a teacher's role more effective as well?
Yeah. Well, we are coming to the end of our time together, and we've been ending each episode of this podcast with the same question. So we'll do a little rapid fire response here. And the reason why we end with this question is sometimes I hear from folks that they think we have made no progress over the last decade in terms of better supporting students and teachers. And I think we've made a lot of progress, not as much progress as we would want to make and that kids deserve. But I do think we see really strong examples of bright spots for kids and for teachers. So as you reflect on the last decade, what's the single most important way you think the education system has made progress? And as we look ahead to the next 10 years, what do you think it's most important for us to be paying attention to?
I think for me, I have been in the teacher preparation space for a long time across a variety of roles. And, when I think about the progress and the conversations we were having 10 years ago, they don't in any way resemble the conversations we're having now. The conversations 10 years ago were that preparation didn't matter. If you had a pulse, you could go be a teacher.
Yeah.
That they could figure it out on the fly. And we are having a very different conversation in Texas about the value of preparation and the value of teaching overall, and where we've got the teacher incentive allotment in Texas, where we're paying our most effective teachers up to six figures. Like we've really totally reimagined the entire teacher preparation and support regime in Texas, and I think that I wouldn't have imagined it 10 years ago. So I'm really excited about how that sets us up moving into the future, and then how can we continue to evolve. I think is going to be in the challenge because this world is changing rapidly, and so in some ways it feels like we're getting out of a hole, and now we've got to keep moving and figure out what the world's going to look like in the future.
Yeah, I mean, just looking back recently, some of the work that's happened around reading instruction and what that means for kids, looking at states like Mississippi and Louisiana that have historically really struggled now growing and kids growing at rates we haven't seen before. That didn't happen by accident. It wasn't one strategy or one policy, but I do think there's a lot of inspiration there. I think when I pull back and just look at how we do the work, when I came into this work almost 20 years ago, a lot of the focus was on teaching talent, right? And recognizing that, look, if we're reliant on 3.2 million people to be naturally excellent teachers, like we're going to be stuck because there's not 3 million naturally excellent anything in this country. It's just not how humans are wired, right? And so we have to create a set of systems in which more people can be successful, more students can be successful. And I think looking at things like the way we pair rich content with support for teaching it, the way we think about the continuity, as you teed us up at the beginning of this, Val, of how we prepare teachers and what are the systems in which they work in K-12. I think that evolution is super important and is one of the things that's going to make change sticky if we, again, center teachers and students in that work at every step.
So I agree with everything Ryan and David just said, and I'll pick up on something David said and maybe expand on it, which is I think we're in a moment where I think it's too easy to be cynical and say nothing works, it's all too political, or elected leaders can't get anything done, ed reform, quote unquote, is dead, nothing's happening. And I totally disagree with all of those sentiments, even though there's a lot of national data that's pretty dispiriting about how students are doing on the whole. We now have these bright spots in states like Louisiana, like Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Washington, D.C., that are showing us not just that they're making improvements, and not just in like a handful of schools, but at scale for many, many students. Obviously, we have a long way to go, but for me, that is like fuel. I'm an eternal optimist, but that is fuel for my eternal optimist fire, that it's not only possible, but it's possible at large scale, and that we're starting to get a lot better at knowing what works and what we need to do. And it is now a choice about whether or not we do those things.
Love that, Jen.
And that was a rallying cry. That's a perfect way to close us out, Jen. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
It has been truly a joy to get to hear from all of you and learn from all of you. Really appreciate you all being here and sharing your perspectives with our listeners. And to our listeners, if you all want to continue to nerd out on some policy details, Deans for Impact recently released a policy framework that draws on what we've learned over the last 10 years in our efforts to make programs more affordable and high quality. So hope you all will take a peek at that as well. Appreciate you all being here.
Thanks,
Bye.
y'all. Great to
Thank
talk to you.
Thank you.